5 presentations, which is a very big menu for the morning, and I'm going to try and be tough with people on the timekeeping, so we really do get a chance to see 5 very different propositions. The subject today really switches from what we were discussing yesterday more towards the role of architecture and urban projects in the processes of development and transformation in cities. And of course, especially in the context of the symposium of the case of world cities and the so-called globalization, which we already opened up a debate about yesterday. Yesterday we looked at this issue from 3 different angles, that of economic restructuring, that of social exclusion and citizenship, and then at the end of the day, governance and planning, which already began to open up questions of the physicality of the making of changes within cities, as well as, very importantly, the whole instrumental process of planning and the rethinking of that process. We began to discuss whether new models of development are possible and emerging, which involved new partnerships for inclusion of many more citizens, of more stakeholders, as New Labour in England would try to call them, and how such models will require a rethinking of the instruments of governance and of social transactions. Today we're going to explore the role of design within that same question of the rethinking of making of cities. Design of the architectural project and of the planning strategy as a catalyst or an instrument for such changes. To pose the question really, can architectural or planning projects be instrumental in changing transactions between rich and poor, between the public and the private sectors, between the formal and the informal, particularly in cities such as São Paulo with a huge informal process going on? To ask those sorts of questions implies a whole range of issues, the sorts of things we discussed yesterday about negotiating processes and planning powers, about capital financing and the economic benefits that can come out of investment, which can flow in many different ways. So whether big projects necessarily will always favor big capital, or whether they can have broader-based, far-reaching values economically and socially, as well as servicing the needs of private capital. Moving towards the more physical, whether the actual process of planning can be changed. Clearly the earlier ideas of master planning are very deeply questioned now, the idea that you can put onto a piece of paper the structure of the future of a city. But we've been through a process, not only in Europe but in other parts of the world, of a sort of retreat completely from planning, of an opening to open market processes, leading to the sort of chaos of competition that one has seen in parts of London, in the Docklands, for example, during the 80s and 90s. And emerging from that, discussions about more strategic ways of planning, not as a totalizing model that represents only powerful interests, but as a negotiated, as a flexible, but credible and financeable strategy for the development of parts of the city. And today we've invited people who are right into those sorts of processes, who are involved both in physical proposals and in the process of the making of projects within cities, to reflect upon these questions. To set the scene, in São Paulo we have Luiz Recaman Barros, who is an architect and also an academic from the Paulista University in São Paulo. And he's going to talk about the dilemmas of contemporary architectural production in São Paulo, to give us a powerful visual connection to what's been happening in the city in recent times. Following him, we will move to Nabil Bonduki, who participated yesterday, so will be known to those of you who were here yesterday, an architect and an urbanist with a long involvement in the social housing program in São Paulo, and indeed the director of social housing between 89 and 92. A process in São Paulo which has changed dramatically over the period of his involvement, and he's going to be talking about how that has been happening and the physical results of that. Following that, two of the architects who've been specifically involved in the Sant André project that we had a preview of yesterday with the video and with the presentation by the mayor of the city. Firstly, Cândido Malta, an architect and urbanist who was secretary of planning in São Paulo city, an academic, much published, but also a very experienced practicing planner and architect. So someone who is deeply involved in the making of projects and one of the consultants on the Sant André project. And following him, Juan Busquets from Barcelona, very instrumental in the transformation of Barcelona, which I'm sure you all know about, combining the qualities of architectural design with the skills needed to renegotiate the political process of the making of the city, which was so important in that redevelopment of Barcelona. A teacher in many places around the world, but also running an office which is doing projects in many countries in the world, including being involved in the master planning, the development of the strategic planning for Sant André. And finally, Richard McCormack from London, an architect who, throughout the development of his practice, has been engaged in projects of housing, projects for academic institutions, connected very much with many universities in Britain, but also projects in the commercial sector, office building, always with an agenda of the connection of social processes and the value of architecture to the whole of the city, as well as the making of good architecture for the client, which in Britain is a very difficult circle to square, to be able to answer the needs of the client, but also make something that addresses broader issues within the city. And Richard today is going to focus particularly on a project which was never built, which was attempting to do this right at the heart of the explosion of global capital in London, in the city of London, where the city was expanding into the edge of the East End, into Spitalfields, and there was a whole range of projects to try to negotiate that position, of which the McCormack, Jameson and Pritchard project was by far the most credible, and Richard will explain how that process developed. So, without any more introduction, I'll hand you over to Recaman to present the dilemmas of contemporary architecture in São Paulo.
I think I would prefer the title, The Stalemate of Recent Paulista Architecture. I would like first to say thank you to the Architectural Association and to the Center for Brazilian Studies for the opportunity to be here to talk on Brazilian architecture, in particular that of São Paulo. I'd like to say please do interrupt me anytime if I don't make myself clear. In this event, São Paulo serves as a model for the understanding of the changes through which cities in a globalized world are going through. This new moment of capitalism seems to equalize different realities and social processes through imagery, in a world controlled by communications technologies. I hope, in the short time I have, to clarify a few myths and perhaps go as far as to show these processes' contradictions, more evident in their advanced posts than in its headquarters. Big cities are said to be again in the agenda of economical interests after several decades of crisis and the apparent ceasing of its initial efficiency. They would now be anchors around which a new production, circulation, and consumption phase would be structured in a world-wide scale in the wake of international economic relations acceleration. So then, a beautiful reunion tale, once more architecture and its ideologues reconciliating with the production world in its new phase, together dispelling the recent history misunderstandings. Now, wiser after the countless criticisms to the results this compromise yielded in the past, they would both be willing to reconsider old theses and together once more dedicate themselves to common good, to regenerate industrial cities' ruins. It's common today in analysis on the city to find enlightened businessmen and more critical architects announcing the hour has come. The city, let alone capitalism, cannot go on living and producing in such precarious ground. As in the past, there will be no lack of proposals and theories about this new, much more pragmatic, l'appel au post-industriel. Architecture or revolution. But if the specter of revolution does not haunt the bourgeoisie anymore, then the war cry is architecture or barbarism. The real city, with its contradictions, eclecticisms, differences, and cultural effervescence, is, as it presents itself to us, becomes everybody's focus of attention, and both New World Order architects and investors. What was a critique of modern cities and industrial capitalism's devastation and alienation becomes, after a quick adaptation, the operating ideology in the four corners of Earth. But what happens in the cities that, during the 19th century, time when European capitals were rebuilt and modernized, were inexpressive villages in the then decadent colonial order, and which today, with their millions of inhabitants, are invited to participate in the New World Order? Maybe by studying what happens over there, we can reveal the wrongs of some compromises which, at the center, go without verification. Brazil's recent history allows us to understand that all the processes cushioned in the regional environment arrive there amplified. These amplifications allow us to better distinguish some phenomena. The following discussion will try to reread Paulista architecture from what I consider the most adequate proposals of this talk, the relationship of the building and the city, which I believe better explains the wider process. The São Paulo file. Excuse me. I think.
The other button.
The São Paulo file. What architectural and urbanistic realities the person studying global cities will face when the São Paulo file arrives at his or her desk? First, the city outskirts, a huge self-built outskirts promoted by last decade's accelerated growth, mushroomed at margins of the law that regulate land use and occupation, areas kept in a legal situation with the acquiescence of authorities waiting for a speculative attack or simply eternalized as social urban exclusion zones. We're talking about the city's crushing majority, both in area and population. 2. Sorry. 2. Shantytown. Public housing projects are popular housing projects. Public housing projects are of insignificant scope after the mega estates experiences like Parque Secap of 1968, a rare quality experience in this area, and for instance, Itaquera housing estate of 1970. Two very different experiences followed. On the one hand, the estates and shantytowns reurbanization of the beginning of the 90s during a left-wing administration, and on the other, the Singapura estates of the two last right-wing administration. The first, aligned with the thinking current in those years, valorized convivial space. It had typological diversity as its chief characteristic, as well as a more democratic access to housing mechanisms. Keeping the population in the occupied spaces, avoiding great evictions, proved to be a viable alternative even to those who all intended to visually sanitize the city, as in the case of the second moment. Singapore housing estates, built in strategic places, screen a largely untouched shantytown behind buildings of vernacular appeal. Data related to this program is inexpressive faced with the total housing demand in the city in the last few years. But to an architect's eye, what's more surprising is the total lack of treatment for collective space, hallmark of the previous experience. Solutions are restricted to the building of edifications surrounded by fences, copying the same demarcating fences the petit bourgeoisie erects to keep robbers from the shantytowns at the bay. And yet, this experience hardly changes the cityscape, in spite of the attempts to use them as shields along main streets. The great mass of spontaneous and disorderly edifications imposed itself. But today, even this program is nearly paralyzed. Downtown. A disfigured and spatially deteriorated historical center. Its features include intensive popular or specialized trade, a wide range of justice-related activities, as well as the stock exchange. The banking sector, originally with its headquarters in the area, still keeps traditional branches, but their operating offices have also moved away. There are nowadays many empty buildings, both public and private, some of which have been targeted by a timid, squatting, ruthless movement. In spite of the much advertised urban infrastructure quality, downtown's emptying process could not up to now be reversed. Some recent efforts have tried to bring public and private investments to downtown regeneration operation. The tenor is, besides infrastructure, the amount and quality of historical buildings transformed into new high cultural centers. In the Luz railway station, we have the Luz convent, the city's most important colonial edification, recently restored. The state Pinacoteca, recently altered and enlarged. Júlio Prestes station, the operational restructuring of the railway will allow the use of its main building as the home of the State Symphonic Orchestra, according to international consultants, one of the best 10 concert halls in the world. The modernization of the railway system is liberating important urban areas, former patios and warehouses, without a public use project as yet. In spite of the incentive to downtown housing being part of this new strategy, there is no project for it, besides the bet on its improvement through a spontaneous attraction that a recuperated downtown would exert on the population. It's worth remembering that there is a huge amount of dwelling places there, but in a growing deterioration and slumming process. Nevertheless, the prospect of this increase seems remote. In spite of the interest in downtown come from, say, enlightened sector of financial capital and public power, data about the occupation of this area pales in comparison to the general movement of the city. As a real estate investment specialist consultant warns, the cost of a retrofit should not exceed 40% of a new construction. Bigger rates are only recommended if there really is a return to downtown, that is, if real estate valorization justifies a higher investment. To break the vicious circle in which devaluation takes place because capital abandons downtown because it devaluates, public investments are called in. These are now justifiable because they are mostly cultural and therefore democratic. Museum, cultural center, theaters, etc. Another technician also warns, the enterprises along Pinheiros River have a higher invested capital return rate. While there is an available, valorizable stock of land, there is no doubt about the new addresses in town. The investments in downtown go against the high profit double spread verticalization of the urban sprawl. Would they be sufficient to revert the logic of decentralization, starting a virtuous circle? Such operation would only be justified for their city memory and sentimental aspects, a kind of good old times mega museum of the Bohemian city. For the time being, we only have the high cultural spaces in the old buildings, at which the elite arrives through complex security systems under the curious gaze of downtown's poor street population. 4. Towards southwest. The history of the city's development shows that the southwest axis was an early investment option. The fact that this axis is reaching the city's limits increases its importance. Business, upper-class housing. Upper-class housing, service, culture and leisure space, etc., concentrated in this seemingly limitless slice of the city. It's not, however, an extended center, not a decentered center, nor sub-center, linear center, etc. We are talking about a movement, not a space, a progressive valorization movement in new speculative fronts sparked by coordinated public and private interventions, leaving behind deteriorate urban space. Even the elite neighborhoods tend on valorizing to be increased in density and to receive commerce and services, pushing those in search of tranquility further away. In the case of high-class residential complexes, this one for instance, Alphaville, the limits extends over 100 kilometers away. Not this, but others reach up 100 kilometers away from the center. But the fact that this is real estate capitals and the elite's strategy does not guarantee an elite space or better quality space. Badly designed, exploiting to the full occupation profitability, changing legislation to obtain bigger profits, the Paulista bourgeoisie builds a poor space, at least from the urbanistic point of view. It doesn't matter. Increasing violence caused by social exclusion, stratospheric levels push the upper class inside their homes, protected by alarms, electric fences, surveillance systems, private armies, etc. The authorities provide the infrastructure to the new businesses, which does not include any space organization. Areas from low-rise houses squeezed in small pieces of land between narrow streets are transformed overnight in business centers without any kind of urban law foresight. We are not talking about a city designed for real estate profit. To a certain extent, all cities are, but of a laissez-faire seen only in the pre-Haussmannian times. The opening of the new Faria Lima in the southwest side cut through narrow streets residential areas. The aim was to create a new front for real estate offices and house businesses, as well as easing traffic in this area increasingly heavier. The city house strategy, then as today, a kind of counter for private business and interests, was the expropriation of the street bed only, leaving the rest to supply and demand laws. The result is the rise of tall buildings in rejoined land, pieces of land not in use, exposed shreds of previous occupation without any kind of urbanistic treatment. From the 30s up to now, under neoliberal climes, the authorities' preoccupation in the city's designs has practically disappeared. Squares, wide pavements, and vegetation are reduced in each successive phase until public space altogether disappears in recent intervention, as for instance at Berrini Avenue, an important example of, and I quote, urban intervention of the last decades. Well, some architecture and no miracle. In the last few years, one can detect a new international style architectural surge, well known here in Europe and the United States. What in the beginning of the 80s was a somewhat self-conscious approximation with the postmodern language by some important Paulist architects hopped onto contemporaneity. High-tech language architecture, not much, colors, glass, aluminum, etc., are repertoire that allows ranking this new global city alongside any other European or American countryside one. This new private sector architecture has dominated recent production. We now witness a retraction phase of the sponsor state, and, in large measure, the state as idealizer of modern Brazilian architecture. Brazil also adopts the Thatcherite minimal state, meaning over there its disappearance as a social agent, taking up the role of the elite's interest direct organizer. In the new liberal context emerges a private sector architecture, at least in the economic capital of the country, without rules or restrictions which guarantee urban quality. This architecture achieves its goal, maximum profit, superficial sophistication, since the building site modernization is less urgent in a country of so abundant labor force, and with its backs turned to the city. Be it due to the last few years' crisis or the weakness of private capital in Brazil, these undertakings range from inexpressive to modest, not guaranteeing, even within this logic, any big unified urban operation. Berrini Avenue, idealized and projected by the most aggressive real estate speculation, is in fact a gigantic lot-by-lot speculative operation. São Paulo, which had always been the private enterprise city in a state-run Brazil, now fulfills its destiny without even the old and inefficient director plans, public strategies, or popular housing policies. A historical digression, but this wild liberalism's fulfilled destiny bears a dialectical relationship with the history of the city's architecture. Thriving private enterprise, a state alternating between strong and authoritarian, these relationships, ambiguous and unorthodox, must be understood in the light of socio-economic history of the country, at least this century. Here I will limit myself to trying to understand how, from the architectural point of view, modern Paulista tradition relates to this mix of urban degradation and high-tech appearance of the last few years. Brazilian Fifth's political atmosphere, taking this 1964 military takeover as a watershed, allowed the architecture to experiment an anticipatory activity, I quote. The same happened to other spheres of social life in those years of industrialization and growth, based on a reading of Brazilian social reality that mixed grandeur and backwardness in a single formula. Some architects, in particular Vila Nova Artigas, came to more clearly contest international architecture and more discreetly Oscar Niemeyer's Carioca school. This renewal sprang necessarily from the new political and economic stage, São Paulo, the great Brazilian metropolis. Faithful to São Paulo's modernist tradition, Artigas will strive to take a leap. An architecture of technique made by working men's hands, which leave marks in the concrete, not whitewashing its deficiencies, didactic, technical, and not technological, without a mask. The architect engineer's knowledge, the future, allied to craft's knowledge of the mold and the building site, backwardness, draw the contours of the new architecture. A developmentist exit for Brazil, a national expression of technique, an original way out of the stalemate of modernization. In the local jargon, it was referred to as progressive modernization, as opposed to the adopted conservative one. Vila Nova Artigas' work was one of the most interesting cultural syntheses that Brazil produced this century, in spite of, or because of, the contradictions at which we shall soon arrive. This architect's work had been just the translation of the developmentist expectations typical of the 50s, the anticipation of a new social order which should be installed. Perhaps it wouldn't have produced so many, if these architects' works had been just the translation of the developmentist expectations typical of the 50s, the anticipation of a new social order which should be installed, perhaps it wouldn't have produced so many fruits, authorized and non-authorized. But the myth of technique brought back the machinist civilization's old contradictions. In the Brazilian instance, technological rhetoric becomes a sublimated form of backwardness. In this sense, Artigas' work is more a negation of technique than a research on national building possibilities in architecture. Technique, structure as a myth, and the social program has a horizon. This modern conflict updated in Brazilian circumstance made of this architecture a comment on the national project's stalemate, which the years to follow would confirm. The anticipation, no matter how close it is, produces a conflict with the present. In those years, the ideological conflict acquires proportion of that cyclopic architecture. To deny an unfair reality was also to deny an unfair city. To the structural exacerbation corresponded an introversion. This movement had its foundation in the Brazilian house tradition, take to its limits, deny the unfair land division, making it define the prism of architectural volume, a possible collectivism in the limits of unity. The protection given by a large cover embracing these space volumes and protecting them from the exterior, cyclopic and cozy, the Taba Brazil dialectics that could not constitute itself as a project nation. Taba means Brazilian Aboriginal large house. The technique, myth, craftsmanship, and the structure form synthesis are some of the many other architectural aspects we can highlight. All this set against the real city, which does not admit alteration and against whom all the militant energies are expended. From his large oeuvre, I select the architectural and urbanism faculty for its a synthesis of the activities of this engineer, teacher, architect, militant. With the ultra-conservative reaction that dominated the country from '64 to the beginning of '80s, Paulista architecture developed on the tripod: popular knowledge, technique, and structure form synthesis. As Artigas' disciple Sérgio Ferro relates, quote, with the realization of this architecture, unavoidable immediate frustration and crumbling of the developmentism, this architecture starts to be tinted with greater aggressiveness and to destroy the balance and flexibility it possessed while believed to be feasible. To the postponing of hopes, a renewed and stronger affirmation of its chief positions came up. The aggressiveness of form, often confused with brutalism, was the tenor of the three directions taken. The first one, faithfully represented by Sérgio Ferro, developed an architecture of approximation between technical and popular knowledges in his few housing experiments. Through a critique of design as a building site domination tool, these architects researched popular technologies to promote housing social projects in unfavorable circumstances. It was the most radical critique and therefore had the shortest life in the thickening of political struggle from the end of '60s. Part of its disciples, who in the '80s took refuge in the left-wing democratic and popular movements, today participate of the more general consensus in the defense of a rather vague modernism. The second one, linked to the technological concrete research, will strike the dominant note in the '70s with its state-run companies' architecture, hallmark of these dark authoritarian years. Many are the examples. For this was the kind of architecture of widest diffusion due to its paradoxical closeness to public administration. To occupy and modify the state from the side was the old Communist Party's cliché. If it did not yield political results, it did provide massive commissions to many architects. Even those who belonged to another tradition, the São Paulo foreigners, took a ride in this winning formula: concrete, wide voids, etc. No vestige, naturally, of the old 50s dialectics that strived to absorb and deepen the technological deficiencies of the employed techniques, wooden molds, imprints, etc. The Brazilian miracle, the economical boom of '70s, architecture brought together in a single language the great infrastructure works monumentality and the concrete technology sophistication, bridges, power plants, etc., often projected by architects, on the one hand, and large state-run companies building of the dictatorial period. The underground universities, bus termini, administrative centers, etc. Hallmark of the most violent years of the military dictatorship, this kind of architecture hardly made it into the '80s, the years of the ambiguous redemocratization of the country. And today, when it resurfaces, it does so as a pale reproduction of the great past commissions. Without the state, this trend found itself lacking a sponsor. Due to their affiliation proximity, these trends can often be confused in their rhetoric, particularly the second mentioned above and the third trends, by some anachronistically called minimalists. 50s formal research based in the concrete plasticity and building methods indicates the way for one of the aggressiveness mentioned. In this third path, the myth of technique as an aesthetic aim, not as a technological or constructive one, reappears in all its ambiguities. In the case of Paulo Mendes da Rocha, the foremost architect of this tradition, the architectural procedures radicalized and explicitated in the 60s increasingly give room to abstract tectonics, almost immaterial, in brutal contrast with the material's weight. I highlight the Sculpture Museum of 1987, a much advertised work and possibly responsible for the critical confusion between buildings, form, and function, from Sculpture Museum to minimal work. Function with no form and form without function. Functional spaces are underground and above ground spaces are empty, articulated by a vast beam sculpture referring to the surroundings, in a dissonant remark to Épaté les Bourgeois, their old 1930s stately manor house neighbors. Once more, a past lesson is radicalized as language. Here, Paulo Mendes conceptually separates the issues of 60s by him highlighted. Let's recall Villanova Artigas Architecture School building. It can be read as an urban object from its exterior, despite being in a university campus, and as a micro-universe from its interior, shelter, celestial dome, and satellites. With a filter produced by social expectation laws, volume structure is maximized and the architectural program is minimized. Once more, in Artigas we have the entire relationship conflicted between these poles in collision route, but in the museum we have the cleansing of the object sculpture being synthesis element and not minimal, and a constrained architectural program hidden underground. This collectionless museum, stillborn, was never able to constitute itself as a cultural reference, none more for its sophisticated merchandise launch parties. Maybe Paulo Mendes' ironic remark has transformed it, at least, into a visual reference for the city. Of the tendencies of the brutalist tradition, this is the only trend that had any insertion in the 90s. This architecture, though, is not responsive to the tertiary metropolis modernization needs. It remains due to its reference to modernity's high culture as a fad of an enlightened bourgeoisie eager to detach itself from the cultural eclecticism of the new emerging elites, or due to its old connection to the public power dedicating itself to the projects of some museum, schools, public space, etc. Entrenched in the academia, the Paulista School has no longer a link with the city's economic activity. If it never had, at least it has ideologically influenced thinking about the city. In the three trends presented here, it has produced the city's concrete gray face, raised its administrative buildings, and projected the possibly most interesting series of houses in Brazilian architecture, some of the hidden treasures of our metropolis. Though small in size, these houses open themselves to ideologically to the new sociability universe, experimental laboratories for the functions no longer possible in architecture. But the state's running out of breath and consequent weakening great architecture should be carefully looked at. Let's go back to the beginning of 80s, the so-called lost decade. Hesitant redemocratization, slowing down of economical growth, political frustration caused by the rapid traditional elites' reorganization in detriment of emerging social movements, etc. This was perhaps the most important ambiguity, the growth of political organization of the up to then anecdotal Brazilian people, liberating itself from colonial tutelage, the action of the ruling elites, and the militarized and depersonalized state. The latter, redesigned in the struggle between popular force and economical elites. These elites ended up regained control, now in a semi-democratic game full of traps. All these forces helped to shape 80s architecture in an often direct and not always clear manner. In São Paulo's instance, we can think of three great perspectives or possibilities. In her personal research, tracking influences of different origins, the architect Lina Bobardi projected and undertook at the end of the 70s a paradigm of recent Brazilian architecture, Sesc Pompeia Cultural Center. This is a brilliant synthesis of the discussions harking back to the 20s Paulista modernism following the 50s path. Lina translated the pre-64 military takeover socializing utopian expectation, popular housing research, infrastructure projects, etc., into a social-cultural utopia, which more than a project for a desired society gave Brazilian people cultural diversity a voice. In its metropolis synthesis, reaffirming the modernist motto of the modern character of Brazilian popular culture, Lina cooked up a cultural factory, the Sesc Pompeia project, partially using an old factory in the Industrial Lapa neighborhood, another empty space produced by the deindustrialization of the metropolis. This intervention also dealt with this historical change. There emerged a real city history, breaking with that abstract city, modern interventions victim, which helped to disfigure the already fragmented city. Social and cultural center for the lower petit bourgeoisie, this complex has also become a cultural reference to the city. The focal point is that of the user pedestrian. An internal street runs through shreds and new buildings as an extension of the city streets. Concrete, big shelters, covering different spaces, modern building language. At all Paulista school elements are present, but two features highlight it and invert the meaning of that tradition. The opening of a real convivial space, not an empty space, and a critical intervention in the existing world. Historic context, social space, and modern language, a difficult synthesis wherever there were no mannerist attempts. In the building site, an archaeological and patient work discussing and accepting suggestions from works who in many cases defined solutions. Her Italian origin may have been responsible for her apprehension and re-elaboration of this untranslatable spatial halfway of Brazilian sociability, non-monumental, non-public, non-intimate. Because we have never built a public order due to the obstacles of our colonial history, the most important Brazilian cultural phenomena take place in intermediate space that sometimes are aggrandized, neither public square nor the home. Brazilian popular culture has a strict tradition of corners of backyard, a semi-private space open to visitors in formal parties. An Afro-Amerindian tradition adapted to European colonial city design. This Brazilian space has a permanence that cut through our contemporary metropolises, as well as the so-called popular culture in the Brazilian sense of the word. Another important project, also a paradigm and also in the updated Brazilian modern tradition, is the Latin America Memorial by Oscar Niemeyer. But this updating happens in a key opposite to that of the previous case, the construction of the urban fabric of unity and of the whole, even in terms we were used to expect from this architect's work. A populist operation, reminder of the developmentist years, now returning as a farce, the personalized government man in search of a popular appeal. And who better than Niemeyer to give shape to the image anxieties of Brazilian government men? Of anachronous rhetoric, what it hides is more revealing than what it shows, the involuntary alignment of a modern master with the radical contemporary architectural form fragmentation experiments. These two ways that opened the 80s are what Brazilian modern architecture had to say about the changes the metropolis was going through. One, sensitive to the new airs brought by the redemocratization, bringing to light the popular experience up to then unknown to the Centro-South elite, and the other, a swan song of the enterprising state. Originated in the 30s, it determined the course of Brazilian modern architecture and was then preparing to act in the New World Order. None of these proposals, though, provided answer to the needs of capital in transformation. It was in search of other forms to spatialize and reproduce itself. So an architecture linked to the private investor is going to gain definitive strength. The third way is completed, rehearsed over decades. A commercial alternative, a kind of bastard son of the Paulista school, can now expand unhindered. With a few important examples in mind, big business architecture starts to shape the city's design in the wake of post-miracle economical transformation. The most radical image is that of Paulista Avenue and its bank buildings, trying to accommodate to the commercial building program and the teachings of Mies, Artigas, and Reno Lev, among others. These buildings foretold of a new eclecticism. None of these schools had much to say on their own about this new architectural symbol for the new phase of city. The end of 80s postmodernism is not an option that betrays the brutalist tradition, but an internal necessity, a level already reached in these serious language and comfortable arrangements of this tradition. The step for the adoption in terms of great architecture of the irreverent language experiments take place in the international, mostly American stage in those years was taken with the Gasperini City Corp Center building. I stop here. It's in Paulista Avenue in the beginning of the 80s. Not only as architectural language, but also as urban interference. A New York-style internal square links Paulista Avenue to Santos Street. This concentrated public space, climatized and invigilated, a summary of the city, which will make life possible in the distant back offices placed in the urban desert of the new city outskirts. And it's like this, liberated from all language of urban constraints, that Paulista architecture redesigns the new city, scattered, post-urban, shiny, between unity and the whole, better saying the rest. There is only advertising contracts. Office towers, or working as publicity towers, take the minus sign of the 50s equation, neutralizing its negation character. We are left with the discussed unity whole against the whole fragment, an increasingly emptied ambiguity inserting the formation of the city. Some views of Southwest architecture that I can't not explain. Now, reacting against this anti-social publicity architecture, many architects try to give it other directions, trying to channel its enterprising strength toward the right place, adjusting growth axis, defining a minimal public space, inserting it in a sustainable environment equation, to give back to architecture all the premises from which it had been liberated through these years, a partially possible operation only in places where the centuries architectures could not be achieved so freely, therefore completely, as it was in Brazil. Out of place, over there, the new strategy heralds its paradoxes again once more clearly. Just finishing, from modern architecture that wanted to put in order the capitalistic land disorder in the name of the apparent machine order, we now have an architecture that wants to participate in the new post-industrial production genesis, investment, capitals, jobs, urbanization, etc. One goes from the globalized capitalistic logic to urban qualities without any gradation, as if they were not perspective or largely at odds. To save cities of uncertain cities of uncertain role in the New World Order through urbanism. What ideological overload is this? Some complain of modernity's excessive utopianism, willing to reactive it without this ideological extra. What to say about these urban operations that want to save capitalism in peripheral territory and which do not really confront the fact that its productive and machinist and urban era was a phase in its historical process of capital accumulation, and if we participated in it productively, that is, industrially, in a precarious way, the new accumulation phase allocates us another role, dematerialized and deterritorialized, to use the current jargon. Capital production as opposed to capital good production, has in its overseas possessions a niche to exploit, labor and environmental legislation flexible or non-existent in order to maximize the exploitation, low-wage and informal works. And why not saying urban disorder and precarious space as well? If urban chaos apparently hinders production, the illegal character of Brazilian society, informal economy, informal city, informal citizen, it helps this neoliberal process of super-accumulation. There is no conflict between social and urban degradation of a city like São Paulo and the New World Order. Some ideologues of present planning, and to speak of architectural ideology after the modern seems improper, but this time we have reached the limit. Recent worlds and São Paulo histories tell us that also this limit is historically given, therefore defined by ongoing conflicts, and not by good sense or humanitarian criteria. São Paulo has, I think, the second or third world's private helicopter fleet, as well as the queues to have cars armored before only a chief of state preoccupation. War is also a breaking of humanistic boundaries. So what is the limit? Will there be one above the conjuncture adjustments between the global and the local elites? That's all. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Luiz. That was a fantastic tour de force. Tremendous amount of material. I'm going to ask people to keep their questions and comments, and then at the end we're going to have a general discussion. I want to move straight on, and we're going to go through all of the presentations. Otherwise, we're going to run completely out of time. So I now turn to Nabil Bonduki, who spoke yesterday, and he today is speaking on the architecture and poverty, the social housing program in São Paulo in the 1990s. Nabil.
Good morning. Today I'm going to speak about the social housing policy in São Paulo in the early 90s when I coordinated the social housing program in the city of São Paulo. I'm going to emphasize not only the policy, but mainly the relationship between the housing and the architecture. Because in this experience in Brazil, restart the relationship between architecture and housing. That in the 40s and the 50s was very important with important projects by Reedy and other authors, architects, with the very strong influence by the modern movement. But during the 16, 70, 18, wasn't present because the national housing policy never wasn't worry with the project of architecture and urbanism. I'm going to show the main characteristic, the old, I call old housing policy in Brazil by the National Housing Bank and the Coab's housing company during the military regime and after too. Because the characteristics of this policy explain well why the housing policy in that moment don't give importance to the architect. the architecture. In the first, the housing policy was completely independent of the urban policy. Here you can see two examples of complex housing in that time, in the 80s, where you can see the complex complete independent of the city, in the outskirts, without transportation to the city, without social and urban facility, and of course very big complex, because in this moment the main preoccupation, the main worry of the housing policy was build by company and build new house. This is another important characteristic of this policy, because they have only one program. There are other programs, but a very few housing was produced. Only by a new complex by company. They were built 4 million housing at that time. In this kind of housing complex, the homogeneous project, without preoccupation, worrying with the environment, with the diversity, the cultural diversity, without any relationship between the urban around this complex. This complex provoke several problems in the environment. You can see in the right, with the erosion, because the very bad architecture and urban project. Another characteristic of this policy was the centralized and authoritarian policy. The federal government determinate all the programs for the cities, and the cities don't have autonomy. The companies, or the housing company of the cities, of the states, don't have autonomy to develop themselves programs. I'm going to show the new policy. I know new policy is not the policy of City Hall of São Paulo, of course, is a process of debate of a new housing that began in the 80s, in the university, in the movement, so the housing movement, the technicians that work in the works in the house, and in the São Paulo City Hall in the early 90s, this direction was started, and other municipality in Brazil in the 90s, several of these things was developed. I think this the first characteristic is the link between the housing policy and the urban policy. This was very important because Uh, the link between the housing policy and the urban policy, with a small and medium complex in empty lands in area with social and urban facilities, the diversity of programs and projects, urbanization of squatters, rebuilding of slums, new complex by self-help managed and self-help housing, new complex by company, land regularization, these several programs for several problems of housing in the city. And on the other hand, decentralization with popular participation in all aspects, in aspect of several aspects, the project, the partnership about the city hall, no governmental organization and company association to management the projects and the enterprise, and respect of the environment. All these aspects characterize this new policy and the new relationship between the architecture and the housing. The participation was a very important aspect of this policy because we worked with a very poor project. It's not like the project Luiz showed it before. We need to build for a very large number of people that need housing in São Paulo. São Paulo has, I said yesterday, 2 million of people living in squatter, 600,000 people living in slums, and more or less 1.5 million or 2 million the people that live it renting very bad housing in the back of the main housing in the outskirts. And these people claim for housing, and the policy utilized this force, this reivindication for work in the project. One important program was the relationship between the city hall, the technical support, that was a new kind of architecture. Is the architect that work with the people, that do the project with the people and debate the condition, and the community associator that management the building of the complex. Outer work was the council of housing that debate the policy. Here it's very important the participation of the architect in the outskirts. Was a new kind of architect. It's not the architect in the only in the office, but is an architect with the people. Of course, this architect do the project too, and need to develop it a new methodology of project, or new methodology to communicate it with the people. Several models, electronic models, or mobile models for the people understand the project and debate with this architect. And other interesting development of this system was the city building. The city building is not a place where the build start, but is building with the objective to remain after the end of the building as a communitary center. And the architecture is developed with very simple material or very simple technicals, a space different of the space of the house, with a very strong possibility of diversity of use for an assembly of the people occurs, or in city building. As a place of leisure and a place of any activity of the people. Well, I'm going to see some project that I choose because we built 250 projects in the city in several programs, and you can see the diversity of localization of these projects in all of the city, in the outskirts, of course, but in the center too, because there was several programs, and the rebuilding of slums was one of these programs, and was very important. I'm going to show. It's very important the link between the localization of the complex and the urban policy. Of course, this project was small. It's not like the first I show, but it is in the city with water, with light, with transportation, and the occupation of the land, the empty lands, was very important in all this policy. Other characteristic of this project was the closed space. All the projects have like this or more developed patios and several other open space inside the complex. It's not like the modern block, but is a new preoccupation. Several projects was made by self-help housing, but collective self-help housing, not individual self-help housing. And the rebuild of slums was very important in this situation. Is a very old building that was recuperated and built a new building in the back of the first building. The urbanization of the squatter and a very new proposal of architecture in the housing. First, I'm going to show this interesting project because it's a little urban operation in the center, very close to the center of the city. This is the area near a very important avenue to the east area of the city. And here there are a very old building transformed in slums. This is the building, and with analysis of the around of this slum, we found a very old and with only one floor buildings, an empty land, and all this area was occupied by slums in very bad condition. I speak about this yesterday. This is the area. Here is the build, the old build, the other build. Here is the empty land, and in the back is empty land. This is the new project with the remain the old building and open a patio inside of complex and 4 blocks around the patio. It's interesting because this project have a commerce area in front of the avenue. There are a nursery. There are a laundry facility in the top of the building, and the old building the project was transformed in cultural center. It's not only a housing project, but is a social and community equipment for the city and for all this area around this project. That was an area with several other islands. This is the project of the complex. It's a very small private housing because the proposal is build a collective area to support the housing in this complex. There are, of course, influence of the modern architecture in this proposal, but it's very appropriated by this situation. It's draw about the project. This is the nursery, the building, and this is the project ready. Here's the old building, the new blocks, the patio here, and you can see the city very close. Unfortunately, the new administration don't finish this project. In the front of this block, there are the commercial and office block to the street, and this is it's not made. Now this is outdoor Islam. Is a small project, but important to show because this was the proposal in this area of the city. Rebuild several slums like this. There are a lot of people living here, and this project show that it's possible put all these people in the same area of the old Islam. This is the project. That project and this was made by the team of the Superintendência de Habitação Popular of the City Hall of São Paulo. I showed that yesterday is the rebuild of the build. This is the project. As important in the situation of the slums, exactly this situation you can see here. A big building of middle class and the social housing beside with the mix between the social classes in the city. This was important for several aspects. These people needed take public transportation to go to the job. This area there are several social facilities, and the price of the work of these people is of course smaller, because in São Paulo, in Brazil, the people that the work include the price of the transportation. It's important too in the city this situation because these people not only work and take transport for several hours of the day, but they can't spend his time in the qualification and the education that was very important for the people low income in Brazil. This other project is other situation of empty land. Is a land remain of the canalization of this stream, and the local power decide in this area here implement a park, and in this part of the land implement a housing complex. It's a very well localized, near of the underground, near of the train, near of the road, a 10 kilometers of the center, but is a zone we can see verticalization of middle class. In this project, the architect is Padovani Hector Villeca, built several blocks, but in opposite of the modern block, this block is closed in the side and closed in the back. In the back of the, you can see better here. In the back of the block is a private space for the evolution, the progressive housing, and in the front of you have a patio, several patios for the people that live it around. Is interesting in this project because you have the same implantation of the rationalism architectural project, but this closet became this in another design of the space. You can see here the patio. It's a space very utilized by the people. Of course, this is a very strong density in this project. In 12-13 meters square, we have 300 housing. But this is important because this land was very expensive, and it's important to put a lot of people. But this project it's very interesting. You can see here there's some shine in all of blocks, and very good position of very good orientation, and the density doesn't provoke a bad housing condition. This is another project, two in empty land in the outskirts. In this situation is exactly the outskirts in the self-help housing, individual housing, in all this around the project, the complex, and this project occupies 3 blocks with 100 meter by 100 meter, exactly the block, the traditional block, with 2 blocks for housing and one block for social and leisure equipment, school, nursery, health center. This is the position. The entrance is very strong, is market, and here there are a commercial area. Here you have the patio with the community center, and there are two blocks, one open for the street, another open for the patio. Well, this is the entrance. This is reverse, is not important. This is the block ready. It's interesting in this case, the open of the block directly to the street. This is important characteristic of several of these projects. The relationship between the block and the street, because in this situation is very traditional in the street in Brazil, and traditional in the block of the Coabs and National Bank, Housing Bank. The complex is completely closed for the street without any relationship. This is the entrance to the patio. This is the tank, I think it's very high. I don't like this tank or water tank, but this is the patio, and in the patio, exactly the same situation of the street, the housing open. Other interesting difference between the traditional block is the difference between the flowers. It's not the same facade. Facade. Is the black in the back? There are space to the growing of the first floor of the housing. There are several bridge between the blocks, and this give a very interesting aspect of this project. This project was built in self-managed. The people built this complex. Is a very interesting architecture, but it's important to say that the people themselves built in this system self-management. It's important say this. I finish. Yeah. It's important say this because normally people said the good architecture need to be expensive. This is not expensive. It's very cheap. Is more or less 40 or 50% less cheaper than the traditional building. Finally, I'm going to show a build in a squatter. The urbanization squatter, and this is important to say, is the first example of Singapore project that Luiz said before, developed in the Maluf administration after Astor administration. But in this situation, they build a new complex with the same characteristics, the relationship with the street, with the patio, several, the same characteristics of the others. But on the other hand, this is not the only intervention in the squatter. We take out the people in the street. In the squatter, this squatter is very, very big. Have 40,000 people living in that squatter there. And with this work, you put here only a little part of the people that live in the squatter, and the squatter was urbanized with putting several urban facilities. I'm going to pass very quickly because I don't have more time. But it's open the street. It's interesting this vernacular architecture. The street with a curve. Never the architect has been this draw, but it's the draw that the people in the spontaneous occupation of the land implanted. This is the facilities, several facilities in this in the end. It's important to say the cost of this intervention is per family only 20% of the cost of the one housing, a new housing in the new complex. Other aspect of this works and several resultados. Bom, I have other things to show, but I don't have time. I'm going to finish to say that it's important the development of this project because it's the possibility to do the act to the people, the poor people that traditionally made his house alone. Thank you.